Brilliant. Thanks, Kayla. And we've got very little time for this session and lots to cover. So I'll try and ask short questions, and I would really appreciate short answers from the speakers. I'm going to throw the same question to all of you to start off with. We've discussed quite a lot today how all of these things are matters of balance. It's a question of where we are on a spectrum between who has the power. And I would like to ask all of you, do you think we've got the balance right at the moment, or should we be moving in one way or the other? Richard doesn't want too much judicial power. Catherine doesn't want too little. Have we got it right and we shouldn't have any more or any less? Or have we got it wrong in some way? And Jill, do you think the regulators have enough power at the moment? Richard?
Sure, thank you. So no, I don't think we've got the balance quite right just now, although depends at what level of detail you look, I suppose. So I would, Catherine spoke as I did about the Human Rights Act, I would amend it or possibly even repeal it. I think we had the balance better between political authorities and the courts a few years back. So although I'm, there's much to be said for the central place Parliament has, I think we are a little bit out of balance.
Okay, lovely short answer. Catherine, do you think we've got it right at the moment, or should the judges have more power?
No, not more power, but I think we're broadly about where it should be. The fact is the courts can rule. The courts are extremely sensitive to the allegation that they are doing politics by other means. In other words, that they're being used as a political vehicle or as a political tool. And you often see judges reject cases as they say that this is not appropriate, or they say our role is simply to check on procedure, not to look at the merits. And even if they think the minister has got the decision wrong, they will not interfere. It's really important to have the courts there as a check on power.
Okay, terrific. And Jill, the same with regulators. You might think they've got too much power, or maybe you think they've got too little, or have we got it about right and we should protect what we've got?
No, I think that ministers have too much discretion. I think regulators probably need to be more independent, and the political price for ignoring them should probably be a bit higher. It's too easy to do that, and the conventions surrounding them become too weak.
Okay, lovely. Let me stick with Jill for a minute, just to sort of keep some continuity. One of the things that members were saying this morning was, if these regulators don't have teeth, what is the point of having them at all? We've got all this regulatory kind of infrastructure, but they can't force decisions. Would you go along with that sort of cynicism, or do you think they're actually useful even without teeth, although you want them strengthened?
So what they do is they shine a light on issues. So, and that's why I think transparency comes down to end up as being really quite important. So if you think about these things, what do these bodies do? They raise the political price of doing something by exposing it and forcing ministers. Take the Owen Paterson case. They sort of, ministers were forced to override the results of that process rather than it just happen automatically. And why did Owen Paterson end up resigning? Because there was a big political backlash against the way in which the government had handled that. So they're about raising the political price to do that. And we do quite a lot of that in government across a lot of areas. We don't stop ministers doing things, but we make it politically a bit more hard. They can't do it behind the scenes.
That's a really interesting example. They put the information out there, don't they? If you hadn't had the regulators, we wouldn't have even known about the Owen Paterson case, I suppose.
Yeah, and the question is that enough? Is that enough for us, or do we actually want to beef them up a bit more? And that's why, just quickly, one of these issues about the advisor on ministerial interests is who gets to decide what they investigate. Is it the Prime Minister, which is the current position, or should that advisor be able to do it just because they think there's a problem?
Yeah, okay. Good to try and stick to some of these examples, I think. It makes it more real for people. So it was really appreciated that both Richard and Catherine used examples of cases to support their own case. So Richard, you talked about the prorogation case and how you thought the judges had gone too far. And Catherine, you talked about that case, the Unison case, which is about paying fees to go to employment tribunals, and you thought that the courts were useful. Would you like to respond to each other's cases? Richard, do you disapprove of the case that Catherine cited? And
no, I'm afraid not.
Your argument on prorogation?
No, so I mean, the Unison case is a case that Catherine and many other excellent lawyers approve of heartily, but I think it was mistaken. Because I think the Parliament had given the job of deciding what level of fees should be set to the Lord Chancellor, and it was the Lord Chancellor's job to decide that. And the court had a role in supervising it, for sure. I mean, it's the many ways the Lord Chancellor could misuse that power, including by setting a sort of an irrational level of fee. But that wasn't what the court concluded. The court effectively concluded the Lord Chancellor has to get it right. We'll decide if he's got it right. Has he set it just the right level to discourage a certain number of cases, but
just to be clear, you think the court did a good thing there or did a bad thing?
No. I think the court ended up taking over for itself the job that Parliament had given the Lord Chancellor, deciding what the right level of fees should be. And the court says, well, the Lord Chancellor is acting for a proper purpose here, perfectly proper to recover some of the costs of the tribunal system from people who are applying, perfectly proper to try and encourage people to settle their disputes. The court just thought, well, we wouldn't have set it at this level. Now, that's not the court's job, I think. And it was a political controversy for the reasons that Catherine outlined, namely the number of cases seems to fall, and is this the right way to do it? Perfectly proper for the Lord Chancellor to come under a whole lot of pressure to change the position. But I think the court ended up deciding that instead of the Lord Chancellor. And that
very interesting. I think, to put it in the terms that the members have heard before, Parliament had given the Lord Chancellor the power to make secondary legislation, and the Lord Chancellor had used that to set the fees higher, and the court said he'd gone too far. So you would be on the side of the Lord Chancellor there, whereas Catherine says that the court was right to intervene and to send it back to Parliament. Catherine, what do you say on the prorogation case that Richard raised? Do you think the courts went too far there?
So there were two issues in the prorogation case. One, should the court even hear the case at all? And I think the answer probably was absolutely correct on that they should have done, although the views are divided on that. On the more difficult question on looking at the issue of prorogation, what the court said was that this was a power that the executive had, but the power was used in such an excessive way. Remember, the prorogation was for not the usual 3 or 4 days, but 5 weeks at the most sensitive time in the Brexit negotiation process. And because it was used in such an excessive way, it undermined the rule of law, to undermine the role of Parliament, because Parliament essentially was turned off. It wasn't allowed to sit during that time, and therefore the court said Parliament should be allowed to sit and debate some of these most sensitive issues at the time. So I think on balance the court probably got it right, because it essentially empowered Parliament to do what Parliament was there to do.
Okay, a Parliament comes into all of these examples, I think, doesn't it? And I mean, Parliament is my thing, as members know. I do wonder whether all of this is about a failure of Parliament in some way. And Jill, you talked about the ministerial code. The ministerial code is controlled by the Prime Minister. In the Priti Patel case, the Prime Minister got advice from a regulator and chose not to follow it and got away with it. Was that a failure by Parliament? Was the political process failing there?
Well, maybe, but should she have bullied her staff? No. Should it be an automatic sanction that she has to go for a breach of the code? It's just a convention. But actually, I want to come back on the prorogation case, because I think that's a really interesting example, though the two lawyers will no doubt disagree with me and say this is very naive. Because what we've always depended on before is, on some of these cases, is actually the regulator. Isn't anyone we appoint. It's supposed to be actually the Queen. Because why do you not go and ask the Queen to prorogue Parliament in circumstances that looked like you're doing it for narrow political benefit? Because you would embarrass the Queen. That used to be, when I was a civil servant, if any civil servant said we can't do that, that would embarrass the Queen. The government would run a mile from doing it. But now you actually have a position where ministers don't feel so constrained by that. You can't do that. That would appear to be drawing the Queen into politics if we went and asked for this sort of thing to do. The problem with the prorogation was that they asked. And I'm sure that most of the civil service advice would have been, you shouldn't be asking in this case. So we have all these things that depend on having ministers who are embarrassed by breaking conventions, and the breakdown comes, and when you look at the things again, is if they don't appear to be as embarrassed as earlier generations thought they should be.
So in your area, is it a case of wanting to give regulators more enforceable powers? I mean, Jane showed us that diagram earlier on, where you've got some regulators which are just created by the Prime Minister, some are accountable to Parliament, and then some, like the Electoral Commission, actually have enforceable powers, which begins to get you into the area of the courts having some role. Do you think more regulators should have enforceable powers?
I mean, I think the question is, do they have powers to do things under their own authority? And it's ultimately, as Richard would say, for Parliament to decide whether to give them those powers. They don't create them themselves. Parliament decides to give them. The trouble with all these regulators is in a system where ultimately it comes down to the sovereignty of Parliament. If, and we're seeing this at the moment with proposals to change the powers of the Electoral Commission, if ultimately a government with a majority decides it's created a regulator and they become too powerful, they're using their powers in the way that the government with its majority, that Parliament doesn't like, then ultimately those regulators can be abolished. It's harder to abolish ones that are set up in statute because you have to go to Parliament and ask them to abolish them than one that's just set up in an ad hoc way that I'd like to have this advisor. Oh, actually, I don't really want that advisor anymore, so I won't bother to appoint somebody, and the post falls away. But ultimately, in a system like ours, it comes down at the end of the day to Parliament. And one of the interesting things is that many of these bodies we have, these independent bodies, ministers are always going on about how much they dislike what they call quangos. Don't know if you've heard those independent bodies with their powers, because actually those powers should be with democratically elected politicians rather than unelected bureaucrats who are appointed by ministers. But actually, the moment there's a scandal and ministers want to say, no, we're dealing with that scandal, they instantly grab for, I'm creating an independent person to do this. I'm setting up an independent body. And look, we're taking it away from politicians because you can trust these nice independent people. It's nothing to do with us guys. And so we've always got this sort of tension between, it should be us, we're the democratic people, we've got the mandate, versus we're ducking out, we're giving it over to these two law professors. They're really respectable people and they'll make great independent judgments.
I'm not so sure about that.
Let me bring the others in because we're going to run out of time. Richard, you said we need to hold on tightly to parliamentary sovereignty. You're very much defending Parliament. But when we talk about parliamentary sovereignty, are we really talking about Parliament or are we talking about ministers? Because on this case that you were talking about, you're talking about the Lord Chancellor being able to exercise powers to do something that Parliament hadn't even seen. So where should those limits lie in terms of what ministers can do without Parliament seeing it? And shouldn't the courts be able to step in those instances where ministers go too far?
Well, if a minister goes beyond the scope of the power that Parliament gave to him or her, then absolutely the court should step in. But the court, I think, doesn't have a role to remake the power or to decide that Parliament's given too much power to the minister. Parliament might well have. That's a live political controversy, and parliamentarians will rightly debate that, and law professors will criticise them for their judgments there. It is, I mean, our system is one of parliamentary government, as you know, so the government has a sort of very significant role within Parliament, but that tension there, I think, is a productive one. And in relation to the Unison case, it's not that the Lord Chancellor was making fees with no engagement with Parliament. It's exercising a power to make secondary legislation that Parliament had conferred, and parliamentarians had noticed and were paying attention and were trying to bring political pressure to bear on the government. It wasn't a sort of secret course of action or anything like that. So I mean, the Unison case is I think a slightly startling one, because the court really does get into, well, what level of fees should they be? And that, I think, is not for the court, even if it does feel a kind of proprietorial interest in the courts.
Catherine, do you think things could have been improved here if Parliament had been stronger? If Parliament had been able to confront the Lord Chancellor about the fees without it even going to court?
I think they were, actually. That was
I
going.
was asking Catherine.
Oh, sorry, forgive me.
Listen, I mean, absolutely, we have a system of parliamentary government, but it's not exclusively parliamentary government. You know, there are three branches of government, as you've heard a lot about in this series of lectures: the executive, Parliament, and the courts, and they are in a constructive tension. And specifically on the Unison case, just to remind you, this was the one about the employment tribunal fees. Remember, as a result of the level that the fees had been set, they were set very high level. 80% of cases stopped going to the courts almost overnight. So there were a lot of people who were being denied access to justice. And the fact was that Parliament had not intervened in any way to deal with this very specific problem of people not being able to get their case heard. To give you a really concrete example, we're doing a lot of work with EU migrants who are very poor indeed. And the way employers make money on out of poor people is that by not paying them their full pay. So £50 would be cut from their salary. They would have had to pay £500 to go to an employment tribunal to try and get the £50 back. And then you've got Phoenix employers who disappear overnight. So these people were effectively being denied access to justice. And it was this very issue that the courts, and remember the courts are there to ensure people have access to justice,